Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of the Influence Continuum. I have a very special guest today, a journalist, Mary Jo McConahay, who's one of the most prominent Catholic journalists in America. In the 80s, she's written several books about, and I should say you were a legendary war correspondent covering the Central American insurgencies. You've written The Tango War, the struggle for the hearts, minds, and riches of Latin America during World War II, and also Maya Rhodes, One Woman's Journey Among the People of the Rainforest, which you won multiple book awards for, so congratulations. But I'm very interested in your most recent book, Playing God, American Catholic Bishops and the Far Right. And all I can say is there's a lot of very valuable, important information I believe the public needs to understand, including in this current moment of ethics of the Supreme Court justices, a majority of which are Catholics. And I think a lot of my listeners don't understand the nature of the schism that seems to have cropped up with the far right and our current Pope, who is a moderate force trying to reform things. So with that introduction, Mary Jo, how did you decide to do this book, Playing God, American Catholic Bishops and the Far Right, please?
Well, thank you, Steve, for featuring the book and for having me on for this conversation. How did I come to write it? January 6th. I, like millions of others in the country, were watching the president at the time, President Trump, speak. I have been through coups before, reporting from Latin America, and as he spoke, and as we saw on the camera, the gathering crowds outside the Capitol, I said, this is a coup. In fact, it was a coup that did not succeed. What really drew my attention was among the people who were wreaking such violence there outside the Capitol and eventually inside were crucifixes, signs that identified these individuals as Christians, and depictions of Jesus with a MAGA hat on. And I said to myself, wait a minute, what is happening here? I need to look into this further. At the time, I had just come off of a wonderful journalists fellowship called the Alicia Patterson Fellowship, which gave me a year to investigate the future of the Catholic Church. That was my topic. And I had already, you might say, a big head start on where the Catholic Church was going. So, and that had been during the time of COVID, and I spent a lot of time interviewing on Zoom and reading. So I was already jump-starting when I saw January 6th unfold.
Right.
That is how I began to write the book.
Yeah, great. And is it okay if we name a few names of some of the far-right Catholic bishops in the United States, some of whom were not believing in the vaccine or even COVID was real, much less supporting the Stop the Steal?
Well, we can name them. I sure did in the book.
Yeah, please.
Do you want me to do so? Yeah.
Please tell our listeners the story, because I want everyone to understand there's a group of people who think the current Pope is satanic because he's quoting Jesus and saying we should protect the poor and immigrants and our earth and climate, and we shouldn't be so judgmental about gay people. And the far right, wing are like, what? Satan has taken him over. And this is in a, Catholic church.
remind me of that point when I finish speaking about the COVID, which you
Please.
Introduced a moment ago. And why was the COVID important for this kind of book? Because this book suggests that Christian nationalism was what was on display at January 6th outside the Capitol, and that the most far right of the bishops are also Christian nationalists. And COVID is an example. I use it as the very first chapter, the introduction. I call it the plague of illusion. What is Christian nationalism? It's a political ideology. It's based on the belief that God intended ours to be a Christian nation. Mm-hmm. And Christian, according to a very strict definition, which would not be everyone's definition. Why did I start with COVID? Because that to me was such a good example of one of Christian nationalism's, how should we say it, of Christian nationalism's attempt to undermine the government. In this case, you had bishops, let's say the bishop of my own city, Salvatore Cordileone, who comes from a hardworking Sicilian family and has called the COVID a kind, especially the restrictions on people put out by, in this case, the mayor of San Francisco. He called them a move against Catholics. He did not get the vaccination. Mm-hmm. He spread lies about the vaccination, saying it didn't really protect you. He served the poor breakfast unmasked, distributed Holy Communion unmasked. This is supposed to be a model for Catholics, and yet he was undermining the very government and authorities' suggestions, which were based on science. There were other bishops who did the same thing with regard to acting as if the restrictions to protect us from COVID were, in fact, somehow anti-Catholic and anti-people of faith, because they limited the number of people who might be, for instance, in a church at one time, early on. Mm-hmm. The Supreme Court, in its earliest decisions, certainly supported these restrictions. After Amy Coney Barrett was put on the Supreme Court, and as the COVID went along, the Supreme Court began to side with people like the most far-right U.S. bishops.
Can I just say, I believe Pope Francis was encouraging vaccination. Am I correct?
Absolutely. Pope Francis called not getting the vaccination a form of suicide. He said that the vaccination was an act of love, that is, in the sense of charity toward our fellow human beings by protecting them as well. Pope Francis, before he became a priest, was a scientist. He knows science. He had an extremely moving and important event early on in the COVID, when in an empty St. Peter's Square, he walked across, rather hobbled as he has become by some of his medical conditions. And he gave a sermon about the apostles who were on the Lake of Galilee and all worried and not having faith. And he said, this is the time where we need to pull together.
Mm-hmm.
And by pulling together, we will save ourselves. So, in other words, Pope Francis is very, very much on the side of science during the COVID. And that was one of the ways that you could see early on in my book, for instance, this kind of schism between U.S. Catholic bishops who are very far to the right as a group,
Mm-hmm.
the Conference of Catholic Bishops, and Pope Francis.
Mm-hmm. And I read in one of your reviews of your book that just an informational point that the Pope named Robert W. McElroy a cardinal in 2022, who was considered a more moderate, bishop, so that he was undercutting the extreme right. Am I correct about that one?
You can take it as you will, but the fact of the matter is that he did name Bishop McElroy a cardinal. And by doing so, he expressed a lot of faith in the kind of pastoral outreach and emphasis that Cardinal McElroy has. I could say that at the same time, Archbishop Gomez, who was his superior, his metropolitan, the Jose Gomez, the Archbishop of the largest archdiocese in the United States, Los Angeles, did not become a cardinal. Archbishop Cordileone, who has a tremendous record of service in the Vatican, did not become a cardinal.
Mm-hmm.
The kind of things that actually was never an archbishop. He went, if I'm not mistaken, straight from bishop to cardinal. Mm. The kind of emphases that McElroy has is a deep reverence for the earth, for a real respect for the great encyclical of the Pope, Laudato Si, which was a call to attention about climate change. McElroy was one of the two representatives from the United States to the Amazon Synod, which was examining all of this, I think 4 years ago now. Mm-hmm. And I would say, rather than looking at it in terms of whom he skipped over, look at the kind of guy that he picked. Mm-hmm. Now, these other folks that didn't get picked don't have an outstanding record, for instance, on paying attention to climate change. Cardinal McElroy believes that anything that is not forbidden by doctrine we might have a conversation about that. Mm-hmm. For instance, women being in the diaconate. Mm-hmm. And this is something that the far right bishops don't even want to entertain. They don't want to entertain any kind of further acceptance of women into the leadership or hierarchy of the church. I'm speaking broadly, but my point is that there are some who are known for opening their arms, opening the windows, as Pope John the 23rd said when he called Vatican II, opening the windows of the church and being in the modern world. And those about whom I write in Playing God are not among them. And they, unfortunately, are the majority of U.S. bishops at this time.
Wow. So I just want to tell the listeners who know that I'm Jewish, my understanding is that Vatican II the Pope said the Jews were not Christ killers. This was part of God's plan, and renounced, the virulent anti-Semitic teachings against Jewish people. Am I right?
That certainly was part of the work of Vatican II. And you said the Pope said it. No, the Pope surely signed off on it.
I see.
But it was a synod of bishops from all over the world. And they said, one of the reasons that now I don't go into this in the book, but it's probably something that could come up for discussion sooner or later. One of the reasons for Vatican II was, since you brought it up, the fact that you're Jewish, is that after the Second World War, people of faith, having seen what happened there, having seen the Holocaust, having seen the incredible number of people who died on the battlefield, said, what did we do wrong by not being able to prevent this?
And I want to just add, if I may interrupt for a second, just say my research for my book, The Cult of Trump, it was my understanding that Father Coughlin, who had 30 million followers and was a Nazi sympathizer, was a virulent anti-Semite. So there was some responsibility, perhaps, that the Catholic Church felt to correct the record.
Right. I think absolutely. Not only the Catholic Church, but all people of faith. Some of the most important contributions to Vatican II were from people of other faith backgrounds. This is ecumenism. This is reaching out to people of other faith sets, and even this Pope has reached out to Muslims, which is a big point in this, what I call a schism or a brewing schism, given that so many U.S. bishops have gone on record as being Islamophobic. At any rate, the Second Vatican Council, as you say, certainly made long-awaited leaps, and that was one of them, what you just described, Steve.
Great. So let's go back to January 6th, Stop the Steal, and Christian nationalism, and those. I guess I want to ask you, too, about charismatic Catholics who are part of this Christian nationalism, phenomenon, who, kind of got together with the Manhattan Declaration and said, we're going to go after women's right to choose around healthcare, gay rights, and wanting to increase religious freedom to put forth their point of view and undercut anyone else.
Among
comments?
the 70 million Catholics, among the 70 million Catholics are many, not a majority. The majority of Catholics, by all polls, are very pro-Francis, something like 80%. Mm-hmm. But there is a loud and very active, and I must say very well-funded minority among the Catholics who stand on all these points that you mentioned. A very patriarchal view of what faith ought to be, and a abortion as the preeminent issue among people of faith, among Catholics. Mm-hmm. In fact, the United States Conference of Bishops says in its policy statements, preeminent. Pope Francis believes that not one life issue ought to be preeminent over the others. Care for the poor, euthanasia, capital punishment, all of these are life issues. Care for the earth, climate change, these are pro-life issues. Not one is preeminent over the others.
Very interesting,
This,
very useful.
yeah,
Please continue.
yeah. No, I think the point that I want to make with this business of certain Catholics being, for instance, traditionalist Catholics would, well, they do. They want the Latin Mass back. Vatican
Mm.
II said, look, let's worship in languages that are our own, so that those who know Latin, I mean, I know Latin. I studied it for 5 years,
Mm-hmm.
but I just as soon have my Catholic services in English or in Spanish if I'm abroad,
Mm-hmm.
because it's more human. It doesn't separate me from the celebrant. And it is showing me that my faith is part of the modern world. That is not what the traditionalists, for instance, uh, my own Archbishop Cordileone. And when I mention him, I don't mean to say that there aren't dozens of others. He just happens to be in my backyard, or I happen to be in his backyard.
Right.
Yeah. So these groups that you're speaking of within the church are very supportive of the most far right of the bishops in the Catholic Conference. And this is, we're talking about 270 mostly white men, most of them middle age or beyond middle age. Nothing wrong with being a white man past middle age, but that's not the face of the church in the United States. It's certainly not the face of the church around the world. One important thing that Pope Francis has done is to make sure that women are going to be included in an upcoming synod. That is, synod is usually is defined as a meeting of the bishops of the world, but he has made sure that a certain number of women are going to be voting members at this upcoming synod, which is meant to look at the aspirations and even criticisms of present day Catholics about the church and define its mission for the future.
Yeah, that's astounding. Like so many progressive steps he's taking.
Yes, it is. I mean, it's not as if the time hasn't come for it.
Right. Totally.
But
long past
yes.
due.
Right.
But,
and he's a man of 84. He's a man of 84. And it's not at all clear that his view of the world and his view of the church, his view of the world as, his view of the church as the people of God, which is right out of Vatican II. It's not entirely clear that will continue if he leaves us either by resignation or in death.
Right.
It's certainly not clear that he will have enough time to appoint enough bishops to kind of what I would call right the ship of the U.S. Church, because the majority just elected its new president for the next 3 years, which will take us through the U.S. elections for president in 24. And the person that they elected is a paradigm of the kind of right-wing clerics that I talk about throughout my book.
Oh, that's very concerning. I can't help but mention funding from non-Catholics to the far right, including the Koch brothers and others who have just an agenda to try to emasculate, or maybe that's not the right word, the United States government's power of separation of church and state.
Yes. The Koch brothers and other very politicized donors completely see that the right-wing Catholics have the same agenda, and that is to really eliminate this curtain between church and state.
Mm-hmm.
The Catholics who take the example of Tim Bush, who is a billionaire from Southern California, who started something called the Napa Institute, where in the wine country every summer, really big shot bishops and big shot leaders of various very conservative apostolates. That means groups within the church who have a certain vision of, for instance, with youth, they have a certain vision of what youth Christianity ought to be, and it's very, very right-wing. That's an apostolate. At any rate, this is a breeding ground for many of these apostolates, this Napa Institute. And Tim Bush is also a business partner with Charles Koch on various projects. And together, they donated to a new business school at the Catholic University of America, which is the only pontifical university in the United States. That means it answers directly to the Vatican. And so now we have a business school there on this Catholic campus, which is meant to, as they have said themselves, Koch and Bush, kind of give the Catholic version of capitalism and to show how they can work together. Well, the Pope is totally against unfettered capitalism, unregulated capitalism of the kind that we can believe that this business school is meant to promote. Koch himself has funded more than 40 Catholic universities and colleges. And with that funding comes a certain point of view, libertarian, unregulated capitalism. This is something that Pope Francis is not behind.
Right. And I read a book about the Koch enterprises that described it as a corporate cult, frankly. Ayn Rand is like, selfishness is good and altruism is evil. Ideology is in there. A version of greed is good, and whoever has more money wins, or whoever has more power wins. And the Koch, entities are pushing free speech, but it turns out to be the freedom to discriminate, and against, again, any government regulation around oil and fossil fuels, which is a source of a lot of their money and power. Not to mention how they screwed the indigenous people with their oil stuff and the pollution that the Kochs did to get around it. There's a very dirty history that people need to understand, where the money is coming from for these political enterprises to manipulate minds.
Absolutely. The Council for National Policy, about which Ann Nelson writes so well in The Shadow Network,
yes,
does make a reader think about cult-like aspects, the secret meetings they hold, the clandestine manner in which they seem to communicate. And
yes.
if you read some of, or listen to some of the tapes that have been kind of smuggled out of the meetings,
yes.
of the Kochs and the others in the Council for National Policy, for instance, there is a kind of language that is used that is very, very compelling, that one hears often in religious settings, in faith settings. This communication is very difficult to pin down among all of these various groups. I have a whiteboard the size of this bookcase behind me. You can't see it. It's huge. And on it, at the beginning of this, I attempted to make connections among all of the organizations that Leonard Leo, one of the founders of the Federalist Society, and someone I call the court whisperer for his advice given to presidents, Republican presidents, about whom to nominate to the Supreme Court, especially President Trump. And do you know, by the end, and I hadn't even gotten them all, I couldn't even tell which was which, because these webs of dark money organizations are so complex and intertwined that they make it very difficult for an outsider, a journalist like myself, to penetrate. But you can come up with a bottom line, which is that...
I'm sorry, continue.
That dark money is out there. It's supporting everything from voter suppression to anti-woman legislation to Islamophobia. Many of the groups are funded by the same people. And many of them...
And I just want to add, it's not just U.S. businesses and such. Foreign governments who want to undermine America can be funding a lot of these through these front organizations. And Mary Jo, I don't know if you know my story, but I got interested in the issue of cults because of my recruitment into the Moon cult in 1974, where I was indoctrinated to believe democracy was satanic and we needed to infiltrate the U.S. government and make it a theocracy and destroy the separation. And that, in fact, the Moonies were founding people of the Council for National Policy. And it was one of the council's people that became the founding editor of the Moonie newspaper, the Washington Times. So for me, my getting out of the Moonies and realizing, oh, I became a fascist, and oh my God, who was I involved with? Who are all these people? Not only is Moon not the Messiah, and we're not going to build a kingdom of heaven. This is a fascist who wants to destroy anyone who doesn't agree with what they're teaching.
Well, you certainly come from the inside and carry a great deal of authority on the subject because of it. But, I didn't even go into the possibilities of foreign support, but I can say that we aren't going to know. Why? Because of legislation like the Supreme Court, the actual
Citizens
case name
United,
is
yeah. They called it.
Well, Citizens United for sure. But also there's a California law that said that donors needed to be identified to nonprofits. Long story short, Charles Koch's organization and Tom Monahan, the Pizza King, founder of Domino's, one of the most right-wing Catholic promoters of traditional Catholicism out there, got together and brought a case in the California courts, where most of this money is in California, and the Supreme Court decided that indeed donors could remain anonymous. So we do not even know where this money is coming from. we have really good guesses by seeing who's supporting the court cases, who are writing the amicus briefs.
Yes.
Amicus briefs to try to convince one justice or another used to be rare. I think there were 12 or 13 per case up until a certain a point. At the Dobbs case, which overturned Roe, there were 140 amicus briefs.
Wow.
It's like everybody wanted to put their 2 cents in and to go on record as being for or against that decision.
Right.
This whole point was the whole point I think that we were making here is that we're not going to know about foreign governments or about even many individuals supporting these various nefarious causes because the money is dark, as Jane Mayer beautifully
wrote the book, Dark Money.
Wrote the book, Dark Money.
We do know that
And
Putin spent $100 million with the Washington, D.C. PR firm over 10 years. We do know he slipped an agent into the NRA to push how we need more assault rifles because, of course, Putin would love for Americans to kill each other, as we're witnessing daily, acts of mass violence. So for sure, we know Putin's spending a lot of money. The Saudis or the Middle Eastern oil, probably, but we don't know that for a fact. But let's come back to the Catholic Church, the fact that you indicate that most American Catholics like the current Pope, like the current Pope's policies, and yet these extremist American bishops are wanting to push their agenda. And what can we do?
Well, inform ourselves,
right?
Read.
Yes.
And dare I say, pray.
You can say pray with me. I honestly, I pray too, because we need something bigger than us to help, because humans are making a mess of things.
And participate, jump in, find a corner of the issue that you feel passionate about, whether it's climate change, whether it's women's rights within the church, whether it's transgender and gay rights, because these are all on the block with the most traditionalist Catholics. And these are issues worth fighting for. I know everybody says participate, but it's really true. Start small. Start small if you want, but inform yourself.
Yeah, inform yourself and then start with your family and friends. Don't just go on the internet to strangers, but start local and inform yourself.
Exactly.
And connect with others who are activists.
With regard to
we need to
Catholics,
vote too. Enrolling people into voting is going to be crucial for the presidential election.
Absolutely. I think also with regard to Catholics, you put money in that collection basket every Sunday or make other kinds of donations. I think we have a right to ask where the money goes. Where is our diocese investing? Okay, everybody needs buildings. Everybody needs schools. These are all proper expenditures, and we need to invest money in order to make more money. We have responsibilities. Let's say that the bishops have responsibilities toward the people they employ. Priests have to be paid, little as it is. Nuns have to be taken care of in their old age.
Yep.
And so investments are what make money for that. Find out where it goes. The Vatican says we should be divesting from fossil fuels and from destructive industries, let's say clear-cut logging in the Amazon or in Alaska or in somewhere else in the United States. Find out if our parishes or more properly, our dioceses have investments in these kind of entities.
Good point. All money really matters.
Follow the money.
Follow the money.
Follow the money.
That's what journalists
Follow the
always
money.
say. Follow the money.
That's right.
Can we go back,
That's right.
please, to the Stop the Steal rally and Bishop Strickland and Vigano and, more information for my listeners, please.
Yeah. The night before the Stop the Steal rally, there was something called the Jericho March, the name coming from the incident in the Old Testament where the walls of Jericho was surrounded and they brought the walls down, and people, thousands, walked around the Supreme Court in a threatening manner.
Mm-hmm.
And among the many, and this was a Christian nationalist event.
Right.
And among those who delivered comments, kind of "we're with you" presentations were the former papal envoy to the United States, Vigano, who has suggested that the Pope needs to resign, that he isn't really a pope, that he's a false pope. And this is something, by the way, when he said that something like a dozen or 20, I have to look at my own book, U.S. bishops came on board with kind of a character, saying that this man was a positive character, that Vigano was trustworthy and spoke from the heart and everything else. And they have never retracted that. So Vigano spoke, and also Strickland from Tyler, Texas. And Strickland is extreme. He is extreme in his views on everything from the COVID vaccine to transgender rights, and a big I profile these people not to concentrate on the most extreme, but to suggest that they are among the bishops their brother bishops do not say anything about it, nor do they give the kind of witness that will you might say, speak to a greater volume than these extremists.
Yeah, silence is a message, right? If you don't criticize.
Silence is a message. As Catholics, we grow up thinking there's this kind of sin, there's this kind of sin, and there's mortal sins and venial sins, and there are sins of commission and sins of omission.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that the bishops are guilty of sins of omission by not standing against this kind of calumny against the Pope, by not standing up in a big way against this wave of voter suppression laws that have come up since just in the last few years,
right?
And especially since January 6th. Now, the Catholic Church has had a lot of, you could call them missteps, or you can call them discrimination against the Blacks among us, among the Black Catholics. But this voter suppression and not coming out against it, to me, is going to go down in church history as one of the grave sins of omission. And so, in answer to your question about Strickland and Vigano, and not to mention Burke, who is one of the greatest Islamophobes in the world, and he's a cardinal of the Catholic Church, of the U.S. Church. These extremists have their shadows among the other bishops. They have people who go kind of in that direction, but maybe not with all the panoply and the attention that these folks get. But the fact that they do not step out and speak truth to power, to me, is one of the grave sins of the church today.
Yes. Isn't Michael Flynn, wasn't he raised Catholic, or am I misremembering?
Oh, yes. No, he's part of the laity that I mentioned in here. An extremist, a right-wing extremist.
He wants civil war in the
Steve
streets. He thinks that Biden and the Democrats are killing children and are pedophiles and other kinds of QAnon and other crazy stuff, I think.
I do go into some detail about the influence of QAnon among the very, very right-wing Catholics and bishops. Also, sad to say. Steve Bannon, by the way, is another layman whom you could count in the bailiwick with Michael Flynn. Laymen who are Catholics support this Christian nationalism of the far right bishops. People like Leonard Leo, people like Tim Bush.
Was Tim Bush the guy who gave $1 billion to Leonard Leo recently? There was some billionaire.
That was, the billionaire who gave it most openly now, because apparently there have been donations in the past, was Saeed Barre, who I think is Jewish. I could be wrong.
I think Ann Nelson mentioned she thought he was Jewish, which shocks me.
I think he is, and I have it. It's not in the book, but Saeed Barre is in the book, and he has now donated $1.6 billion through some machinations to Leonard Leo, who has decided that what the Federalist Society did for judges and turning around really the character of the bench for law, he will now be able to do with media and education. That is,
oh boy,
by organizing. I have a chapter called Ministry of Propaganda, which speaks to the way the Catholic press was taken over beginning in probably the 90s with the neocons and the theocons, some of whom, like George Weigel, are still operating. And the press is another target now of Leonard Leo and these extreme right-wing Catholics, as is education. And they've got a lot of help from the Catholic governor of Florida, DeSantis.
Yeah. Very concerning for the future of our country. And I guess I wanted to ask you, because it appears to me that a lot of Catholics moved away from Catholicism and the Catholic Church into the New Apostolic Reformation, Pentecostal speaking in tongues thing where they're following individuals who claim to speak directly to God. Can you comment on that, please?
Catholics who are disaffected have various exit ramps.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are exit ramps into a more inclusive Catholicism. For instance, there are now some 220 ordained women priests who celebrate Mass and the sacraments. They don't recognize their bishops, but they recognize the Pope.
Mm-hmm.
Others have taken the exit ramp toward Pentecostalism and stopping on the way many in the charismatic practice, but not all, because charismatic practice also is embraced by the mainstream of Catholicism. But what is concerning to especially the right-wing moneyed Catholics, but not only them, is the exit ramp that just goes out into not being a person of faith at all.
Yeah.
And that seems to be where many Catholics are going now, because of this lack of identification with what they see as the church, which is what the U.S. bishops are presenting as the church, which is not the church.
Right.
And unless we see the U.S. bishops as anomalous, which they are when you look at the conferences of bishops in other countries, unless we see them as an aberration and something very, very American of our age, then we will have more Catholics leaving, and many of them floundering, because having grown up Catholic or having once believed in Catholicism, it's hard to shake it. It's hard to shake it. The theologian Mary Daly once said, "You can never be an ex-Catholic. You can be a graduate Catholic, but there's something in you that is always Catholic once you are one." And my suggestion is to folks who are thinking about going on these exit ramps is stay on the freeway and let's all go together. And let's, because it's a hard journey, but I think it's a journey worth making.
Yeah, and a lot of the extremists are pushing hate and fear of the other, and we're trying to do love and compassion and humility and the opposite of, look at my fancy watch or my car. I'm a better person than you because I have an expensive car or something.
Yes, fear of the other is, you hit it on the head. Fear of gay people, fear of transgender people, fear of Muslims. And, Pope John the 23rd's great line, "Be not afraid," needs to come back into everyday Catholic patois.
Right. So there needs to be a lot more messaging to counter the right-wing propagandizing, it seems to me. And that's one reason why I wanted to interview you, to help you have a little more exposure to folks, because it's going to take a village. It's going to take a lot of good people coming together with a vision based on real values and not just fear and not just greed and money. But I want to ask you about Opus Dei. We're coming towards the end of our time together, but I wrote about Opus Dei and the cult of Trump, and it seemed to me like they were bad players in the cult of Trump. Comments?
Opus Dei is not a big part of the 1.3 billion Catholics on the earth.
Right.
They number 80,000.
Mm-hmm.
But I can tell you from having lived in Latin America, where they are a very powerful force, that many of those thousands are in extremely important positions, just as they are in the United States. The Archbishop of Los Angeles that I mentioned
Mm-hmm.
is Opus Dei.
Mm-hmm.
It's an extremely strict and patriarchal view of faith. And it's the individuals, for instance, who congregate around the Opus Dei headquarters, the information center in Washington, D.C.,
Right. Mm-hmm.
are a hit list of some of the most powerful people in Washington. William Barr,
Yes.
Cipollone, the advisor to President Trump.
Leonard Leo was on the
name
advisory board too, I believe.
Sure. Yeah, sure. And so Opus Dei is a is a factor.
Mm-hmm.
Is a factor in the I would say the ultra-right Catholic Church in the United States, a kind of outsized factor in that many of its adherents are in very important
money and power.
Very important
they got
positions.
They got placed.
Especially political. Yeah,
it's really upsetting. I did want to mention to my listeners, I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but there is a trafficking case on behalf of over 40 ex-members of Opus Dei for trafficking them, where women were promised an education and they were slave labor and never got paid and were not given due diligence. So there's an actual case happening right now. I believe the lead lawyer is in Argentina. Sebastian Sal is his name. But I guess I'm interested. Is there anything the Pope or the mainstream Catholic Church can do to investigate any of these right-wing people to find out if maybe they've been co-opted by bad actors financially or through blackmail or anything like that? Is there such a possibility?
Well, the Vatican is investigating its own bank, but they don't have a department or a commission that investigates bad actors. I think the church has other ways of weeding out and disciplining those who most betray the faith.
Mm-hmm.
But what we're talking about, for instance, in my book and in the kind of folks you're talking about, are legitimate members of the church who may be taking it in directions that Vatican II did not want or envision, and that most Catholics do not want or envision. And this is not just a problem for Catholics, it's a problem, in our case, for the United States, because this is one of the most powerful reactionary forces in the country. They happen to be in bishops' robes, but the influence that they have is tremendous. And that's why not just Catholics, but I think everybody needs to pay attention.
Yeah, and am I incorrect to assume that they don't like Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi, even though they're Catholics, because they don't agree with some of their political stances?
As I said, the bishops believe that abortion is the preeminent issue for the church. This is not what the Pope says, but they say that. Even,
Right.
Of course, the Pope's against abortion. But as I explained, it's a life issue that needs to be seen along with other pro-life issues.
Yes.
But because they are so politicized from about the 90s on, the Catholic Conference of Bishops has become so politicized that it has come to ally itself with the most radical parts of the Republican Party, which has put them on the side of people like Trump and has put them in a position of trying to undermine people like Nancy Pelosi, who, according to my bishop here, cannot receive communion in the diocese, and Joe Biden, whom they tried to forbid communion to after he was elected. And it was only with a slapdown that came directly from the Vatican that said, no, you can't do that, that prevented them from forbidding Biden from receiving communion. Why? Because he believes in a woman's right to choose.
Right. Yeah. So, really important book. It's called Playing God, American Catholic Bishops and the Far Right. One more acknowledgement of the current papal presence is the renunciation of the doctrine of discovery, which is something I learned about when I was researching the residential school horrors in Canada, applying my model of brainwashing to the residential schools. I had never heard of the doctrine of discovery, which back, I think it was the 15th century, a pope said, recruit them or kill them, take their land, take their resources, make the children, good Christians, or, they're not valid. And it was wonderful, I think, that was renounced officially.
Yes, it was the sword and the cross. The sword and the cross were the instruments of colonization. And this is one of the things that Vatican II stood against, the fact that the church should not be involved in the state, and that people ought to be free, and this was really radical, to worship or not in their own ways. And I could go on about the Pope's respect for indigeneity, and that was one of the forces behind his Laudato Si encyclical. He really respects indigenous spirituality, which is anathema to right-wing bishops. And I have a whole chapter in this book that speaks to this, and it's one of the core differences with the Pope and some of the bishops in the United States.
And I'm gonna be myself and just say I blame the Kochs and the Putins and the fossil fuel people influencing the bishops, and not that they were just thinking about it on their own and said, "Yeah, let's do oil, and let's not side with indigenous rights."
There's a lot of guilt to go around.
Yeah. So, Mary Jo McConahay, last words. You sum it up and send us off. And I hope people will pick up your book and educate themselves and educate their family and friends. And it's going to take a village. It's going to take a lot of us speaking up, especially, I believe, people of faith, Catholics, Christians of every stripe, to say we got to come back to love, and we got to stop emphasizing fear and hatred of the other. Because this is my faith. Love is stronger than mind control. And even though I've counseled people in Opus Dei as a cult, as a brainwashing cult, and I did 3 blogs when Barrett was nominated for the Supreme Court about the People of Praise as a cult group that practices control of behavior, information, thought, and emotions to make people dependent and obedient. So in the end, I think we need a legal definition for brainwashing and mind control that's based in law and based in human rights.
Well, you said it all. It's a tough journey, but it's one worth making.
Well, I want to thank you so much for your research, and again, the book is Playing God. And there are too many people playing God or saying, God spoke to me and said Trump won the election, so therefore it doesn't matter what all the facts are. Or, God told me COVID isn't real, so therefore I don't need to mask. Or, yeah, let's have a violent coup and insert our will on everybody else. I say and you say, no, please.
No.
Let's be
Thank
together.
you. And yes, it's not just all about no. It's yes to faith, and it's yes to expressing faith and keeping our arms open.
Yeah, and knowing God works through people too. It's not just in a prayer, but when the doctor's giving you a vaccination that can save your life, I believe God's working through that doctor and through the people who helped to develop the vaccine. So, thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, and
great,
and thank you for your work, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.